All right, welcome to another episode of the Captain's Table, where we are gathering around with the captain at his dinner table to discuss various topics, and the entire ship, everyone on board, is welcome to over here, and that's kind of the metaphor that we're using. My name is Steve Kaptain. I have served in missions as a missionary in Asia for over 20 years. And we have various missionaries with us here today. I'm going to let them introduce themselves and a little bit of what they do. But today's topic, we're going to be discussing care for the dying, kind of a different theme. Maybe you've never thought about that before. What happens to your congregants, to the people you're ministering to, and they pass away? How do we care? How do we respect cultural traditions and ways of doing things and everything else? So a little bit different. I'm going to have a couple of our guests share for a little bit first, just to give us some background on what this is all about, what this kind of ministry is about. And then my friend here on the right, Tim, is going to open it up for discussion.
I'd like to start with a Bible verse. Genesis 48:1 says, "Now it came about after these things that Joseph was told, Behold, your father is sick. So he took his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, with him." And what follows after this is his father, Jacob or Israel, telling his sons what will happen with them. This is the end of the first book of the Bible. Joseph, as well as Jacob, die.
He gave them instructions on how to care
for his remains. So the important thing there is what happened. They were there with their father. Mm-hmm. They heard his last words. So
yeah, that's good. That's significant.
So I wrote a few paragraphs to start off the discussion. It says, while the Bible provides no example of extended care for the dying as would happen in a hospice, there are passages that illustrate caring for the dying or encourages it. Encourages caring. In 1 Kings 17, Elijah spared the life of a sick son of a widow at Zarephath. When she saw her son alive, she declared to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of God in your mouth is true." So he cared for two people of different generation, helping them not die. Not by providing food and healing.
Providing for their basic needs, right?
Yeah, food and healing, basic needs.
Yeah.
In the New Testament, Mary and Martha were sisters, and they sought Jesus to come when their brother Lazarus at Bethany was sick. They were very discouraged that he did not come as expected. Yet when he came, he expressed love by crying. Jesus wept. However, an important lesson was given about resurrection, including raising Lazarus from the dead. James 1:27 may express the principle of caring for the dying, where it says, "This is pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God and Father, to visit widows and orphans in their distress." Sometimes care is needed in helping people prepare for death. Booklets about heaven can help focus thought in that direction. When Christians are dying, some particular places in Scripture are most encouraging. Here are some of them. Psalm 103 relates to God's promises and desire to forgive our sins, God's recognition of humanity's frailty, and the reality in our sin-sick world that death is a normal process. Proverbs 139 emphasizes God's knowledge and care for people in their situation, telling of God's plan, care, and purpose. God's care for the dying is shown Psalm 23:4. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Lamentations 3 points to God's loving kindness and faithfulness. Two great songs come from these verses. Great is thy faithfulness, and the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. 1 Corinthians 15, the chapter on resurrection, helps in giving hope. 2 Timothy 4:6-8 shows what Paul thought about his soon departure as life was ending for him. Hebrews 12, verses, encourages believers to look to Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith. With non-Christians, proclaiming the gospel needs to be accompanied by demonstration in front of them of faith and practice. With older Christians, singing old hymns that they know is very important. It brings comfort and encouragement. For those with dementia, often they will remember the song to sing along, even when they cannot ordinarily put sentences together. Steve?
Well, I've been thinking a lot about this topic for some time. I've been working worked as a hospice chaplain. I worked as a chaplain for about 22 years. 7 of those years were in the hospital, rest were in hospice. And so I've been working with people who are dying, and one of the verses a couple of verses that kind of stick out to me is from Isaiah 46. Listen to me, O 3 and 4, verses 3 and 4. Listen to me, O house of Jacob, all the remnant of the house of Israel, who have been born from me from before your birth, carried from the womb, even to your old age I am he, and to gray hairs I will carry you. I have made, and I will bear. I will carry, and will save. And to me, what this really speaks, Israel is Israel is a picture. God uses Israel as a picture for the church, as to his care for the church and for the whole world.
Yes.
So, in a sense, you could say that this is really speaking to God's care for all of us from the very beginning to the very end. And so as I've walked with a lot of people along the pathway of dying, there's a number of things that I've noticed and read and found them to be true. As I've read something, I said, wow, that really clicks. And one of those things is that as people are dying, they are kind of gathering their life together. And it doesn't matter what religion they come from. It's like I've gone through my life, and they could be 18 years old, they can be 65, they can be 100. It's the same.
So do you mean like an evaluation of their life? Is that what you're speaking
exactly.
to? Yeah.
Exactly. Just, so many people, and especially I've noticed this with older people, you come to them and you start asking about their life, and sometimes nobody else has been asking those questions.
Wow.
Tell me more. Tell me more. And for a lot of hospices, they will use life review. They'll actually get some kind of recording equipment and record asking questions, and this can be something for the family because they want to be able to give something and want to be able to have a picture. What does that look like? What did I do?
Mm-hmm. And impart that to the next generations, right?
Exactly. I can give you one example of a guy who it was kind of interesting because I was going to go visit this man, and his family called me, and his family, his children, they were Christians. He was not, and he said, and so they said, we want you to come and talk to our dad. Well, as a chaplain, unfortunately, we're not supposed to go in and just, jump right into the gospel. You know, if people can ask us questions and then we can respond. But it was kind of interesting in this situation because as I went in to visit, I said, sure, I'll be happy to come and visit, you know, and basically talk with him. And when I got to the door, knock on the door, daughter answers the door. Hi, who are you? I'm Steve. I'm the chaplain. The chaplain. You know what? The pastor came the other day, and Dad got saved, and everything's fine.
Praise.
You know, and
We're all good now.
We're all good now. Yep. So I said, "Oh, wonderful. Well,
Story.
I'd love to come in and meet him." Oh yeah, come on in. You know. So I go in. We start talking, and he says to me, "Well, you know, I've been living here for about 50 years in this house, and had really good neighbors, and but I'm saved now, and everything's okay." You know, and then, oh, that's great. Well, and you know, I've done a lot to help my neighbors. I've, you know, mowed the lawn for someone when they're sick. I get groceries and but you know, I'm saved now and everything's okay. And then he'd go on and he'd say, you know, and I always was involved with the neighborhood, you know, what's going on in the whole neighborhood, and trying to make sure that everything was, you know, copacetic and people were happy, and, you know, do whatever I could to help. But I'm saved now and everything's okay. And there was, I kind of heard a bit of a disconnect in there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You know, and as I was listening to him, I was praying. And what came to my mind was 2 Corinthians 5:17, which says, if anyone is, and I told him, you know, I was just thinking, there's a verse from the Bible, from 2 Corinthians 5:17. It says, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. Old things are passed away. Behold, all things are become new. And as I told him that, I said, but you know, some people misread this. And when they read it, what they hear is, when someone comes to Christ, all things are passed away, and all things are become new. It doesn't say all things are passed away. It says old things are passed away. What are those old things? Those old things are those things that we repented of, that we knew were wrong, that that God forgave us for. But when you come to Jesus, he doesn't just take you from here on out. He goes back and takes all of you and says, you are all mine. Every bit of it. And I said, those things that you did to help your neighbors, and the ways that you help those who are sick, God says, now that's mine. And you're mine. And what he said was, he said, I will remember that sermon until the day I die. And that he died about a week later. And but the interesting thing was, that was part of that gathering. The gathering of that. He needed to be able to tell that story, and he needed that story to be accepted, to be validated, because he knew in his heart there was something important about that. That was part of his salvation. God was saying that you're mine, all of that.
So I love that, because in the evangelical world, we have this concept that, if they'll just pray that prayer and say, yes, Jesus, I belong to you, then everything's okay. And everything's not okay. Exactly. There are some things that need to be unpacked. There are things that need to be brought to the feet of Jesus. And many people, they need their stories to be heard and validated. Just like you said, no, it's not. Those things aren't gone. Those things have meaning. They may have greater meaning now. Yes. And to know that at the very end of our minutes, so to speak, that our life mattered, the totality of our life mattered. Exactly. And contributed in some way to the purposes of God, whether we were aware of it or not, is something we all need to not just acknowledge with a faith statement or a quick prayer, but to own and experience. And so, yeah, that's a beautiful thing. That's great.
Yeah. And part of that gathering also is looking at those things that didn't quite measure up. What do we do with that?
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so there's a guy named Ira Byock. He's kind of a classic figure in in hospice care. He's a medical doctor. He wrote a book called The Four Things That Matter Most. And interesting, he's actually Jewish, but he draws from the New Testament and the Old Testament.
Interesting.
And but he says the four things that matter most are to be able to say, I forgive you, please forgive me, thank you, and I love you. And I have seen over and over again where people who are at the end of life have something that is just has not been said. Either they have not said it or someone hasn't said it to them. Being able to be grateful for something but especially those things of forgiveness. And I remember there was one week when I visited. It was really uncanny because you don't have this happen like in 1 week, but I visited two different women. They were both taking care of their estranged husbands.
Interesting.
Wow.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about it was, as we talked, and they kind of talked about, their lives and different things, both of these men were basically at the very brink of leaving this world. They weren't verbal, they weren't talking. But one of the women said to me, I shared these four things, and one of them said, I need to tell him that I forgive him. The other one said, I need to ask him to forgive me. So, in the one case, she said, both of them before I left said they were going to say that, one said, I'm going to ask him to forgive me. That person died like the next day, right after, and he'd been holding on for a long time. The other one was really striking because it was 5 o'clock. I had to close my day out. I had to go, and so she said, as soon as you leave, I'm going to tell him that I forgive him. He died at 5:05.
Wow.
They were just waiting.
Yeah.
Just to have that
Interesting.
permission.
Interesting. I see something twofold there. They're hanging on. They want to take care of that before they let go. But what I'm seeing is how much the process of death and dying, to kind of point toward whatever her name is, Kubler-Ross. I forgot her name.
Yeah, Elizabeth
Kubler-Ross.
On
Yes.
death and dying.
All those cycles that benefits the living, right? How spiritually formative it is for the living to interact and be part of that process and be present. And that's what I got out of that story. It's very touching.
Yeah, it really is. When a person is dying, there's so much going on in their mind. There's so many things, but a lot of times it's just like one or two things you just got to be listening. And, but I've also noticed that a lot of times when someone is getting close to the end, especially when they have dementia or something like that, people write them off. Sort of like, that mom's not there anymore.
Right.
Nothing can be further from the truth. Mom is there. I visited one woman, and basically, the family met me at the door, and they told me, Mom's not there.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, she's over in that room if you want to go and visit with her. And they let me go by myself. They were kind of listening in, though.
Hmm.
What was really fascinating was, as I sat there, one of the things that I've realized is that when you go in and you believe that that person is there, you look at them and you say, I know you're there.
Hmm.
And you say that in your heart. You say that in your spirit. And you say that to God, and you say, I know they're there.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And when you go in with that attitude, it changes everything.
Hmm.
So I went in and started, I introduced myself and told her I was a pastor, and I was coming to visit her, and how much Jesus cared about her. And, she started talking.
Wow.
And she started telling me some things about the family and different things, and I prayed with her, and I'm coming out, and the family's like shaking their head. What did you do? I said, I knew she was there.
Yeah.
You have to believe in her.
Yep. Make
She's
a
not
connection.
gone. And a lot of times too, when people go in with that attitude, families can learn so much
Yes. Yes.
when they start listening and saying and expecting to hear something. They will learn so much.
And what I take from that, and we got to take a break in a moment, but is that that's not just for people with dementia. That was happening with these two women who were estranged from their husbands.
Right.
There was that cutoff. It's a continuum that we all go through in all of our relationships, from they're not there to maybe they're halfway there, to what you said, acknowledging that there is connection between the two of us and a connection with the Lord as well. And then the acknowledgement of that connection opens up the pathways to bring life. So fascinating discussion, intense discussion. It's feeding my soul. So let's take a quick break, and we'll be back to discuss more. Okay, welcome back to the Captain's Table. We're discussing missions, faith, missions, and caring for the dying. So let's continue on with the discussion.
I have some questions I'd like to have us consider. Two connecting questions and the second question. What do you see as most important in caring for the dying in your own family? Is it being present with them, hearing their last words, or something else? And what preparation have you had to care for dying people?
Preparation. Not a lot. Not a lot of preparation, even in seminary. We had some of our classes that touched on it, but nothing that really prepares you to do that. I watched my mom care for my grandmother, her mom, who had dementia, and establishing that connection and just singing worship songs with her. And every once in a while, Grandma would kind of come to life, and she didn't really know the words. She would kind of howl to them or whatever, almost like a little child would to a new song that they're learning. But it was a beautiful thing to watch, and that probably prepared me more than anything else, just watching my mom do that with her own mother. So that would be me.
Well, of course, as a chaplain, I did clinical pastoral education in a hospice. So I had a lot of supervision. And so when I go to visit patients, I would kind of write up my story about that patient visit, and then bring it back to a group or bring it back to my supervisor, and we'd kind of go through it, and we'd do different things like that. So that was in addition to seminary, of course. And so that was I would say that was really a very helpful in beginning to build a foundation for caring for the dying.
I have a question related to that. Just, you said post-seminary, you got that. If you could rewrite your seminary curriculum, would you weave that into it somehow for all pastors, or part of it? Or I guess I'm saying that because I feel like I missed something, you know?
Yeah, I think I would. I would say if you're going to be a pastor, at least having, like I had 2.5 years of clinical pastoral education, which is over the top, maybe too much. But I think just having a quarter year can be really, really helpful. I remember being in a hospital and having a new pastor out of seminary coming in to care for his one of his flock, and just seeing him totally lost, like, what do I do? It's just kind of walking along with him, help him. But you mentioned about the caring for people with dementia, and they would often call me the singing chaplain. So I would go in, and we had this one woman who she was really, really disoriented, and going through a really tough time, and went to visit with her. Actually, before I went to visit with her, the family had said that they didn't need a chaplain to come, so I hadn't gone to visit. But we were sitting in our team meeting, and the nurses and the doctor and social workers are there, and we're talking. And they said, well, this woman is just really, really, really distressed. She just seems like no matter what we do, nothing is helping, And so we're thinking, maybe we could give Haldol, which is kind of a really heavy duty medicine will knock someone out, And I said, well, I had called, and they had said they didn't really need a chaplain to come, but I can call again just to see maybe there's something that would be helpful. And so we went out, and they said, yeah, give them a call. So I called. The son said, yeah, come on out. It'd be great. And so I went out to visit. Mom was in bed, kind of out of it. But I sat down beside her. Son is sitting at the foot of the bed. And kind of from her tradition, her church tradition and everything, I just sort of kind of went from that tradition, and I just started singing a song. And I sang, I want Jesus to walk with me. I want Jesus to walk with me. And I was going on in that song. She looks at me, and she looks at me again, and she starts singing.
Praise the Lord.
And all of a sudden, she started talking. And we prayed together. And her son's looking on, like, eyes, this big, and he's saying, I'm going back to church. But, I've seen that so often with the music, like you mentioned, Tim. So many times people who haven't talked for, who haven't actually talked for a couple months, you get the right song or something, and they'll sing every word sometimes. It's pretty amazing. But a part of that, I think, is because they say that there are different parts of the brain, that read and some singing kind of registers in a different area of the brain, too, for one technical reason. But
somehow it jumpstarts the other part.
But I've also heard that I've also read that the heart itself has memory cells,
Oh.
and so you wonder really what's going on.
Yeah.
Something is literally touching their heart.
That's great.
Yeah, others want to come in on the questions?
Well, I had very little training in ministry to the dying and the bereaved. I had gotten the theory into my head, but the greatest experience God ever gave me was He privileged me to be alongside one of my first friends at the seminary at Fuller. He had been a missionary in his home state of Manipur in northeast India. His name was Romeo Serto. And this man, who was shorter than I was, whiter than I was though, had planted 40 churches in the highlands, in the mountains around Impal. That is the capital of Manipur. And every month he would walk and he would visit every single one of his congregations in those hills. And he would be gone for basically almost the whole month, because he would just be walking to each of those 40 congregations and preaching and teaching and discipling everybody. Then God opened the door for him to come to Fuller to do a Doctor of Missiology. And he was one of the first students I met in the program. And I remember him coming out of one of our professors' classes and said, "Oh, Steve, my head hurts." I said, "Why, Romeo?" He said, "Oh, when I'm in there, his words like da 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 da, and they're so fast, and I can't understand everything." And but I had moments like that with my friend until he got sick, then liver cancer developed, and what I learned was always, because he was my friend. And I just wanted to sit. I was there when he first got the diagnosis of liver cancer. I was there in the hospital with him. And it's not so much as holding the person's hand, but it's just there. I had the privilege to listen. Like, he was gathering his time too. And he was talking about his itinerary when he was going from Impal to the highlands to visit all of the small little churches that he had planted. And talking about his wife Tingo Chong and his son Pauliku, Boipu was his nickname. And what I learned was we were prayer partners, although for the first 3 years of our seminary experience. And what I learned so much was just to listen. And just to listen to Romeo, and then to pray with him at the end. And to try to gather other people, including his wife, because these were in the days before internet. And so it was always by letter. And I remember being in contact with his son and with his wife, and I got to know his family so well, almost as if his family was my family. But when the Lord finally took him home, his son had been brought over. His wife was given an emergency visa to come to be alongside him. And I was so grateful to God that God gathered his family to be here in Pasadena with him. He is in the cemetery here in Pasadena. Mountain View.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So he's buried there. Because it just would have been too much of a logistical problem to take his body back to his home in India. The whole thing about transportation, and then taking it from the point where they would take it from the international airport on the long journey from that airport all the way up into the mountains of northeast India, to preserve his body and everything else. And what I really learned was that we have to be there to listen and to share and to pray. It was really a privilege for me that God gave to me, to be alongside my brother during that time.
Oh, that's great. Now, to help our listeners a little bit, there are actually 3 Steves here. Me, Steve Kaptain, helping to manage the captain's table here, and we have Steve. What is your last name again?
Maury.
Steve Maury. Maury, yeah. He was the chaplain who shared with us in the beginning. And this Steve, who just shared about his experience with his friend from India. Tell us a little bit more about your context of ministry, just so listeners can get to know you a little bit and connect the right Steve with this story.
Well, here I'm known as Steve in Apartment 5 because we've had the privilege to stay most of our sabbaticals on sabbatical from my mission field in Brazil, where I've been for 23 years. And so my context of ministry is as a ministry, I guess you would call it, I'm a professor at a theological seminary in the city of Londrina. I'm also a training coordinator in biblical holistic mission for all of Brazil, for Harvest Brazil, which is our mission agency in Brazil.
Okay.
Just consider me, as I share with my colleagues at the seminary. I share with my the founder and the co-founder said, listen, we're the dinosaurs here. Our students are the ones that are the sharp students that know everything. We're the ones that have had all the experience, and we're trying to communicate this knowledge to them. But I've always learned since God called me that I've had to really be a learner. And whether it's in ministry to the deaf and dying and the bereaved, or whether it's dealing with an 18-year-old who has a zest for living and to go and conquer the whole world for the kingdom of God. It's just a matter of being able to sit down with that person and listen to them, and to be alongside them when there are needs that have to be met.
Thank you.
I'm Steve.
Yeah, thank you. All right, back
Okay.
over to Tim.
I have some more questions to ask. Multiple questions so you can have your choice of what to answer.
Oh, we like multiple choice.
So, how public is dying in the country in which you work? And how have you seen the impact of singing among those with dementia? How public is dying in the country in which you work?
Okay,
In
I
this
thought
country,
about this one.
In this country, we have a lot of homes that people in. It isn't very public.
Yeah. Where I ministered to in Nepal and Kathmandu, it's very public. They do the funeral the same day that they die, maybe the next day max, and it's by cremation among the Hindus. But for Christians, they bury their dead. And it happens out in the open, especially the cremations. It's happening in a public place. Everyone's there, and people just come and watch. It's like there's no boundary between, I don't know, family, those who are invited and those who are not. It's extremely public, and everyone's aware of it, and everyone can watch it happen and stand around and watch, and no one feels threatened by that. I would feel uncomfortable with it. I'd be like, what are you doing, man? Don't just stare. What are you doing? This is not a show. Move away. But I'm the outsider, so I'm just watching what's happening and observing. So very public in a place like that.
Yeah. In Pakistan, my goodness, when I was in the United States, I did not attend many funerals. In fact, I only attended one funeral, which was the funeral of my grandmother. But when I began the mission work in the Middle East, there was people dying all the time. One like maybe 2 funerals a month. And it started to hit close to home, I think, in the first 2 years. My wife's grandmother passed away. And it was a scene to behold, because when the person passes away, there's crying in the streets, and you can hear people wailing. And I'm like, I just was so taken aback by that, because I just couldn't really relate to the grief. It was a shock seeing people just like coming out, hugging each other, because it's most people, they die around maybe 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. I don't know if that's the same in Nepal, but I've noticed that people, they pass away around that time, and then you just hear a cry, and the whole community comes out to find out what's going on, and everybody's consoling one another. And so what they do is they wash the body, they clean the body, and they call all the relatives. And so people have to fly from Dubai, from other countries, because it's a family like honor thing. So people, they take debts, they take loans to make sure they get to the funeral. Partly because they want to grieve with the family, but partly I think it's also because they want to make sure that there's respect. Because people talk a lot in Asian culture. If you disrespect them, why were you not there? So that part is very strong in Asia.
And it's the family you leave behind that has to deal with all that.
Absolutely. And so I was just really blown away. The ironic thing is because I've seen people when they go through the process of dying, somebody would be going through maybe a diabetic battle, and people are trying to minister to them, for the doctors come and visit. But when the person dies, the entire street is filled. We're talking about 300, 400 people coming.
Oh man!
Wow. and later on, I began to question, when this person was dying, maybe 5-10 people were trying to minister to this person and try to encourage them. But when they're actually dead, the whole town comes. So I was really kind of questioning that. But I've seen that again and again. But it is very difficult, especially when you see people who are passing away with young kids. That's very tragic, and I've seen that a lot in the Middle East. And so that is a trip. And so in Pakistan, the funeral takes 3 days.
Oh,
so
wow.
it's a 3-day event. And so the first day is a grieving period. We feed everybody, and then the second day, same thing happens. People come, they mourn with the relatives, and again we usually have services. So there's a preaching program, there's worship in the street where it happens. So so it's very public. It's so within 24 hours the body is in the ground, and so there's a lot of grief and wailing that's happening. So as a person who's coming from the West, it was just a shock to me, and I'm still trying to understand and how to sympathize with people who are going through that as a minister. So
Thank you.
Wow.
Okay, let's take another quick break, and we will be back, and Tim will take us through the next series of questions. Okay, welcome back to the Captain's Table, where we are discussing faith and caring for the dying. Let's continue on with our discussion.
Okay, my next two questions are, what scripture do you find most helpful among Christians who are dying, and how does God motivate you to care for the dying?
Well, I can say that I did want to go kind of backtrack, though, to the one thing about the two countries. I'm thinking about two countries here in the United States. One was Georgia and one was California.
Two totally different cultures.
Oh, yeah.
And the reason I mention that is because part of my work is working with bereavement. And I did services for people who were dying in Georgia. And for the same size, basically the same size hospice, the same number of patients cared for and staff and everything, did the same thing here in California. And what was interesting was I would send out a number of invitations to family members of someone who died, people who died. And so maybe send out, a few hundred invitations. And in Georgia, I would have 200 to 300 people who would come for these services to remember collectively, number of family members, maybe 3 or 4 family members from one person, and we probably would meet in a church or something, and there would be that many people, 200 to 300 people sometimes. same number of people here in California, and we'd have 4 or 5 people come.
Wow.
And I think it's interesting what you said, Kenneth, about the culture and being seen. I think part of that's happening in Georgia too, but also it's more I would say more of a grounded culture or kind of like.
Would you even say collective? We'd say that for Asian cultures where they're group oriented and there's
Community oriented.
yeah,
perhaps.
community oriented. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we're so Americans tend to be very individualized. So we hear, if that's true, then in Los Angeles we're hyper individualized.
And I think this is I've often thought of this as more of a death denying culture, because we're the Hollywood culture. People die, but they rise up. They're awake and okay the next day, so you don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Or they're in the next movie. Or
Next in
they're-
the movie,
yeah,
exactly,
yeah.
exactly.
Always coming back.
So but it's totally different. But in terms of, I think one of the passages which you mentioned, Tim, is Psalm 23, that really has really struck me and been very meaningful, especially as yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will not fear, for you are with me.
Mm-hmm.
And the big thing that I always emphasize is that David is going through at the beginning and he's saying, the Lord is my shepherd. He does this, he does that, he does this, he does that. But it's at that one point where it says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, he changes right there.
Mm-hmm.
I will not fear because you are with me.
Mm-hmm.
I see you. I'm at this point and there you are. You showed up right here. The rest of the time it was theory. Now you have really shown up. And that to me has been something that's been, I've seen to be a real comfort.
Mm-hmm.
People recognize and I say, you can expect he's going to be there.
Mm. I've been hearing this theme of listening and connection during our discussion, where it's very important in our preparation as ministers and even those who are not ministers, your average everyday person, to listen. But it's listening with the purpose. It's listening to connect, to help connect people to one another and connect them to God, to that presence that you're describing. And my question, it's a little sensitive, but I think it's important for our listeners. What have you seen in your ministry for those who fail to make those connections? You talked a little bit with that failure of connecting with people to people, but what about when you're walking through the valley of the shadow of death and you don't see that presence? You're not connected, or you don't believe in it, or you deny it. Do you see a difference between the experiences of those two very different types of people? Could you fill us in on that if you have?
It's a really good question. And I would say, by and large, when a person or when the team is there, when, like for example, the hospice team is there, and they're really caring and they're really listening, by and large, most of those situations, I would say the majority of those situations are places where people do connect on some level. But I have seen it too where they don't. And there is, and I've seen it where there's kind of an eerie sense, And I can remember. You wonder, in one sense we cannot really judge completely.
Right.
I mean, if you have someone that literally says, I do not believe in God and I hate God and I hate you, and and then they die at that moment. I haven't seen that happen. but that would be rough. But I've seen it where I remember it was one of the first deaths I saw. It was in a hospital, and this person was he had a heart attack and coded, and they brought all the machines in and everything else, and they tried to work on this guy. And I didn't really know anything about him, but I just remember going in, not seeing family, not seeing anybody, and just looking at the result of their trying to revive him and it not working. And he literally looked like an animal. I mean, it was like a dead animal, you know, just, and it kind of broke my heart, you know.
Yeah.
I've seen, on the other hand, I've seen people who have really connected with the Lord and with family, and it's a whole other story. You know, they are in a different state. I'm just thinking about one is. I don't have a lot of time, but just thinking one story about a guy who I went to visit with him, and he was a World War II vet. Yeah, he was a Christian, but he said to me, he was telling me one time when I went to visit him, telling me about how when he was in World War II, he was in Africa, and they were being bombed all the time. And they got to the point where where people in his unit knew, they would tell each other, "I'm going to get it today." And sure enough,
They get it.
they get it.
Wow.
They get killed. And he said his captain came to him one day and said, "I'm going to get it tomorrow. You're going to be in charge." Sure enough, it happened.
Wow.
And as he was talking to me, I said, "It sounds to me like you're telling me you're going to get it." He said, "Yeah." So I think it was about a week later, I went to visit, and I walked in, and he was in his room. He was not as responsive as he had been. So his children were there. His children told him, you know, go in and spend some time with your dad. Talk to him. They went in. His wife, and then I went in with his wife. She was on one side of the bed. I was on the other side of the bed. And we talked to him about his life. Told him, you know, that read scripture, shared that, you know, the Lord is there with him, and that he was really precious to God, you know, and he was at that point where the people, what they call chain stoking, and what that is, they stop breathing for a short time, and then a few seconds later they start breathing again. It kind of goes back and forth. And
chain stoking. Okay.
And but he was holding on, you know. And then his wife said, "I've got to go. I'm gonna step outside." She stepped outside, and about 2 seconds after that, he started moving around like he was getting shot. It was like he was getting it.
Wow.
Literally.
Wow.
And then he just stopped. And it was peaceful. But it's interesting as people are dying, a lot of times their death will reflect something of their life. So sometimes,
interesting.
Yeah, they'll like I'll have someone who's dying, especially a lot of times when they have dementia, they'll start talking about, and sometimes not even if they don't have dementia, they'll start talking about their home.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times if you ask more questions about what is their home about, tell me more about your home. And I've had this happen where they'll start telling me, and the family will say, oh, this is the home they grew up in.
Mm-hmm.
Or that was something that they remembered that was kind of precious. And it's kind of like going back to the place that was secure.
Core.
Hmm?
Core.
Their core picture.
Yeah,
Or
I like that word core because that happened with my mom and her mom.
Mm.
But the things she was describing in her home weren't necessarily good, weren't necessarily bright and beautiful, but they were core. And so I like that term.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm. And as a result of my mom listening and asking questions, I believe some things were resolved and released. And I don't know this, but I'd like to believe that the Lord can enter in and even shuffle things around in our core, even at that last moment.
Yeah.
But it certainly did that for my mom and for those who remained. So it's
I love that.
important.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so good.
One final question.
Okay. This is good stuff. we hate to stop.
Okay. The question so, what experiences have you had of sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ with the dying?
What experiences have we had of sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ with the dying or with someone who is dying?
I remember a guy who was Catholic, and he was estranged from the church. And one of the things that I was a chaplain I would do would be to ask them, well, do you want me to get someone from your faith tradition? He
Your
said,
faith tradition, yeah.
I said, no, I want you.
Mm.
I said, okay,
All right.
that's great. And I'm glad to be here with you. And he told me he had been in Vietnam and told me about some things that had gone on with Agent Orange, stuff that he had been connected to, and really wanted to get that off his chest.
Cleanse his soul.
Yeah. And I told him, as I talked to him, I said, as you were there, you were a soldier. You're doing what you were commanded to do. You don't always have the opportunity to, do things as you would normally. And God knows that too. But God also knows where you have made some bad decisions. And He loves you. And He is ready to forgive you. And you can confess right now. And He will forgive you. And you will be cleansed. And he prayed. And I prayed with him. I anointed him. And he went from being just so sad to you could just see the relief. And he died the next day.
Wow. That is beautiful. Can you tell us those 4 questions again?
Yeah.
To review them for us.
It's, I forgive you. Please forgive me. Thank you. And I love you.
Okay. Well, thank you. This has been a great discussion. Thank you for tuning into the Captain's Table. And we will see you next time.